Hi, this is Alex Bryant. Thank you very much for joining the second webinar in a three-part series around counteracting the effects of coronavirus on global businesses. Today's webinar will focus specifically on the disruption in China and the effect that's causing the business expansion into Mexico. This is a second webinar. The first was last Wednesday. That was specifically on the tactical steps companies are taking in Asia and in Mexico around supply chain, around procurement, around qualifying new suppliers, contract manufacturing. If you're interested in that, you can go on our website and download that information. Today's webinar is going to focus specifically on Mexico and how we're approaching that and why a number of companies are looking at Mexico as a way to expand. As we get started here on slide 2, explain a little bit who East West is. Dan, if you would go to slide 2, please. Explain who East West is. Specifically, East West is a provider of operations, commercial, and risk management solutions on the ground in 4 areas: China, Asia, Mexico, Central Eastern Europe. All the executives at East West have lived in these 4 different regions and run companies in these 4 different regions. And all of us have the P&L responsibilities for running organizations in these 4 areas. The main focus here is the team we've got had P&L responsibilities and run organizations in 4 areas in a variety of different industries. So what we're going to be talking about today is the work we're doing with companies, setting them up in Mexico, getting started, why they're looking at Mexico, what are the downsides of Mexico. So if you go to slide 3, please. Here, we're going to be talking today, primarily, we'll focus on 2 of our 9 services, the manufacturing footprint optimization and the supply chain optimization, as companies are looking to Mexico as a possible location to expand their manufacturing supply chain footprints. Slide 4, let me introduce you to 2 members of our team. They're 2 directors of East West executive team who will be joining me today and speaking. First, Dan McLeod, then Mark Plum. Dan, if you would take a brief period of time and introduce yourself, please. And then Mark, if you would follow Dan.
Yes. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Dan McLeod. My background has been, in my career, has been primarily manufacturing, operations management, and management of capital projects, large investment capital projects. Most of my career has been spent in Asia, 21 years. The majority of that in China, but also spent 8 years working and living in Southeast Asia, in Singapore and the Philippines. Most of my experience has been in the chemical industry, but I've also managed operations in electronics manufacturing and food processing. Mark, go ahead.
Yes, hey, thanks, Dan. Sure. Yeah, I'm similar to Dan. My name is Mark Plum, and I've spent the majority of my working career in international, in the last 30 years or so of those in Asia, starting out in Thailand and working my way up through China, and came out of the kind of the general management business development side of things, and spent my last 13-14 years in China as president of Briggs & Stratton. Had 5 factories over between Japan, Philippines, several in China, design centers, manufacturing facilities. Actually had the largest engine manufacturing facility in the world at one time in Chongqing. So pretty much an Asia guy for the last 30, 40 years.
And this is Alex Bryant. My focus has primarily been, I started East West in 2005. My primary experience was focused on Mexico and Central South America, primarily down in Mexico, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, when I started East West, and then also focused primarily in the China and Thailand regions. As we go forward, we go to the next slide, please, Dan. As we get started, I wanted to just briefly discuss Mexico and its own set of unique issues and challenges. East West is focused, as you know, in 4 areas. Right, we're focused on China, Asia, Mexico, and Central Eastern Europe. All of them are developing regions, all of them developing regions and countries. So all of them have issues that are unique to them and are unique to developing countries that don't exist in developed, mature markets. Mexico, like all other developing markets, does have its own unique challenges that we've been doing business here for a long time. But I want to address them because as we go forward, you need to be aware of these, and I'm sure you are. Specifically around personal safety issues, that's going to be more around issues of violence, theft, corruption, to your own personal safety and to your employees. So that's going to affect if you're looking at finding suppliers on the ground in Mexico, you can be avoiding certain areas because you wouldn't send your quality control people down there. You wouldn't send your own engineers down there. There are areas in Mexico that our team will go in Mexico because we've been operating there for a long time, though that a Westerner would not go. We're looking at potential transparency issues, which I'm sure people are familiar with. Those are going to be more cases around the rule of law. It's where you've got maybe trouble getting money out from the bank to get it back into the U.S. or get it back to another region. It's going to be a supplier stealing drawings, intellectual property, which we see obviously in other areas. And local corruption is going to be more around issues of, say, private corruption. You've got contracts with a local logistics firm, and they're raising rates at the last minute before you ship products that you buy from a supplier, or it's going to be some governmental issues such as local authorities are slowing your licensing and permitting in order to receive some payments from that. So those are the issues that we're constantly bumping up against in Mexico, and you have that in other developing countries as well. The team that we've got on the ground in Mexico are all just like myself and Dan and Mark. These are Mexican executives who've been in China, have operated for about 75 years on the ground there. We've got a core team, and they've been working there for a long time. The focus primarily in the automotive and the manufacturing areas, and all of them who are for the team that we've got down there, all of them have all worked with Western companies before in their careers, and fit the same model as the East-West team in Mexico and Asia and in China and Central Eastern Europe. Okay, Dan, if you would forward over to the next slide. Just a brief discussion here around the background, and this is really why we're here. For the last 20 years, Western companies have invested heavily in China. As we all know, they invested there, growing economy, great rates. But then, as we all know, there have been a lot of changes, a lot of problems, particularly in the last 4 to 5 years, and it's continually making China a more difficult place to operate that did not exist previously. The trade tariffs from April of two years ago was only the latest. Prior to that, rising labor rates or some nationalism in 2025. And now you've got the outbreak of the coronavirus. So that's caused a lot of disruption in China. If you go down to that next slide with slide 7, you're going to see a lot of companies now are looking at ways to get outside their dependency on China and looking at other regions. This is really why Mexico has another advantage in Mexico. The coronavirus has highlighted the focus on China and the need for diversification, both on the manufacturing side and the supply chain for long-term stability. Secondly, a lot of companies are operating on the ground in China and are on the ground and view Mexico as a great opportunity to help serve their North American client base, the U.S. customer base. And many of them are now looking in Mexico, if they were sourcing in Mexico, manufacturing and sourcing and supplying and manufacturing products in China, looking at Mexico. There's also a whole group of companies that are looking at Mexico now as a way to establish operations down there and maybe pull from some of their U.S. operations, because now Mexico, with the new additions in the USMCA laws that strengthened MCA and strengthened the relationship there, and with Mexico improving and Mexico still being good cost structure, companies are looking from the U.S. looking to go down there. So if you would go to the next slide, you now can see that it's in our mind, it's kind of time to explore Mexico. So here's our agenda today. We're going to be breaking it into really 3 sections. First is an overview of the advantage of doing business in Mexico, both from an operational standpoint and a financial standpoint. Secondly, we're going to walk through the process when you're looking at Mexico, how you do that to ensure a disruption-free implementation on the ground. And then thirdly, we're going to cover 2 case studies. One was a Midwestern company in the automotive sector who put down an assembly operation in Mexico, and the second is a company out of Pennsylvania, set up supply chain in Mexico. So at that point, I'm going to stop and I'm going to turn over to Dan McLeod. And Dan, if you would get into the advantages of doing business in Mexico. Thank you.
Okay, certainly. Thank you, Alex. Wanted to start this with a quote from Bloomberg that talks about the transformation of the economy in Mexico, really since started before NAFTA, but really jump-started with NAFTA several years ago. The economy has developed a very deep and broad manufacturing sector, such that its exports now are almost 40% of its GDP, more than twice China, and really moved away from oil and energy and extractive industries 40, 50 years ago into a really rich manufacturing environment for companies interested in setting up there. A couple of graphs that I find interesting is if you look at export growth from Mexico in the last 10 years, you see a steady increase in the manufacturing sector driving exports. And so steady growth in that front shows the increasing importance over time of that sector. And then the graph on the right looks a bit at industrial production. Again, steady growth. Industrial production is increasing at a more rapid rate than the U.S., but it's been very consistent, certainly over the last 10 years since the dip in 2000 and 2009. When we look at sort of the macroeconomic indicators, a few that we like to look at is GDP growth. Forecast, the IMF is forecasting growth over the next 3 years, steady growth and increasing growth. It's good to see. In the past several years, the economy has been relatively stable, but the future looks more stable, and the recent trade agreements between the U.S. and Mexico and Canada will certainly help support that. Meanwhile, inflation has not been a significant issue in Mexico and is forecasted to be very much under control over the next few years, dropping down to 1% forecasted by the IMF. So in general, the message being steady growth and low inflation going forward. Some of the financial advantages of doing business in Mexico, highlight a few of these. The manufacturing labor has been an area that companies have, cost of labor is an area companies have chased for a number of years. 20, 25 years ago, it generated a move to China for high labor content manufacturing. Well, what began to happen 15 years ago were double-digit increases in salaries and benefits in the manufacturing sector in China, such that now wage rates in Mexico are more competitive and about 20% lower than they are in China. And so that may be, that's flipped a little bit in the last 5 years. May not be obvious to many people. So China not being the low-cost labor pool anymore, we find Mexico being very competitive.
Hey Dan, we had a question pop up, and for everybody who's going forward this, obviously you can ask any questions. We will be taking questions as we're going through this process, so please feel free to ask any questions. We'll answer them. Those that we cannot get to, we will answer after the email. Dan, if you would go back to the last slide, on slide 14, and before the pop-up, and show the 2 slides. And the question here was, can you comment on the salaries of management technical staff in the industrial areas of Mexico? So as you're looking, you talked here on slide 14 about Mexican labor being about 20% less. Can you talk about the salaries on management and technical staff in the industrial regions of Mexico?
Sure. Yeah, a couple data points on that. Supervisory costs are about 2 to 3 times manufacturing labor as sort of a benchmark. Technical or engineering salaries, about half of what you'd pay in the U.S. There's quite a bit of variation based on industry and demand, but that's that's sort of a general rule of thumb we look at. But as you get into the higher levels of management, plant managers, and more senior people, the gap between the U.S. and Mexico really diminishes, and for senior people, there's not a big difference between the U.S. and the Mexican market. So again, lower manufacturing labor and supervision is quite attractive, technical and engineering skills attractive, but the senior levels, it's a more competitive, a more mobile workforce, and so the salaries tend to be pretty similar to the U.S.
Thank you.
Okay. So I mentioned lower employee costs, and we talked a little bit about that. The other interesting aspect when comparing to China is the lease space. Lease for grade A industrial facilities, whether that's light manufacturing or logistics, warehousing, typically is about 20% cheaper in Mexico than it is in China. There's been a steady escalation in those lease rates that are published, and we find that China in the industrial centers still is significantly higher than other parts of the world, particularly in Mexico. Transportation costs, obviously, if you're producing in China and need to send to the U.S., you're going to be paying significantly more in transportation than from supplying from Mexico. We'll talk a little bit about logistics and connectivity later in the presentation, but there's a well-established rail and highway networks and port networks in Mexico, and access from the industrial areas in Mexico to the U.S. border is quite easy, and much of that industrial base is within 2 hours drive of the border. And then finally, utilities, a bit of a break in Mexico on electricity, which is attractive, but even more so if you're in the case of natural gas and energy, much lower cost in Mexico. The gas distribution infrastructure in China is still undeveloped, and much of the gas supply that's used there is brought in as LNG, which is a higher cost source. So there's very good incentives for all across the operating costs, whether it's transportation, lease rates, employee costs, or energy costs, that make Mexico an attractive investment operation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark to talk a little bit about the operational advantages of doing business in Mexico.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, just to kind of recap a little bit, the Mexico advantages from Dan's view are from a financial, of course, labor, wages, skill set, and availability, logistics to the USA, and of course, now with the new MCA, we feel very strongly about we have good IP protection. So, and as we discussed, probably many people on this call, the whole thing has been kind of turned upside down. China, not everyone, but a lot of people went to China 25 years ago. And really early on, it was chasing inexpensive labor, and then it was, of course, trying to chase domestic market. And as Dan mentioned, all that's really flipped now. And now it's, if you look at the comparative advantages of labor, where China dominated back in the early 90s, and having lived in Thailand and having jobs sucked out of Thailand to China, and having lived and then watched jobs sucked out of Mexico 25, 30 years ago. It's really a turning of events. So now we want to talk about, okay, who's down there already, and who decided to make these moves, and why did they make these moves? So next slide, please. Yeah, next slide, Dan. There we go. Thank you. So we're looking at really with five. These aren't necessarily the top five, but they're the five major industries that have made the moves down to Mexico over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And quite frankly, the most have made the moves because of the location to the USA market, consumption back in the USA market. But some have also made it because of a growing Mexico consumption, and as well as even Mexico now is beginning to position themselves as kind of the center for Central America. If you look at the geography and the infrastructure they put in place. So let's talk a little bit about the five aerospace. There's tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, 300 large aerospace manufacturing companies. We'll talk in a little bit about where they're clustered. A lot of people didn't really realize that, but the Southern California area had done quite well with Mexico aerospace manufacturers. Automotive, probably everyone has a good idea how strong the automotive base is in Mexico. The Monterrey area, the Saltillo area, the León area, almost all the large global brands are represented in Mexico. Medical devices, close to $8 billion of exports back to the USA, over 600 companies, really a well-established industry with labor and component to support. Electronics kind of goes hand in hand a little bit with the auto and aerospace, having the sub-assemblies and the parts to support maybe the tier 1s or even the OEMs, i.e. the appliance guys. And then of course, lastly, the appliance guys, which we, in the appliances would be HVAC, would be of course the white goods. So guys like Carrier, guys like Whirlpool, guys like Bosch are all down there. The Cranes are down there, whether in the water heater business, the A.O. Smiths of the world, et cetera, are all down in the Monterrey, mostly the Monterrey area, but a 100-mile radius. So there's at least five good industries that are well established. Next slide, please, Dan.
Hey, Mark and Dan, we had a number of questions continue to come up. So one last question was, what's the current situation with available space to lease in Mexico? Can you all address that? So if you're looking for existing factory building to lease, what are size properties on the market?
Hey, Dan, why don't you just had some work on that a little bit ago.
Yeah. There's, in general, factory space, warehousing space is available for lease. Anything from 5,000 square feet up to 150,000 square feet. You can find properties available that are on the market, ready to go. If it's more than that, you're going to have a hard time finding anything larger than that that's already built. So you probably have to go to a property developer to do a build-to-suit project that they could build it and lease it back to you.
Okay, thanks.
So I'm kind of moving on, taking a look at this slide here on the picture on slide 18. The green is really the clusters, and as you can see, they really parallel or go along. They do parallel the USA border, really going from San Diego on the US to the far west to Brownsville, Texas for the USA, Laredo on the east, and roughly 2,500 miles. So and it's interesting, if you notice, those are all the states, the Sonoran state, the Chihuahua, et cetera, Nuevo León. Each state has their own economic bureau, their board of investment. So you need to have a good understanding of each state's investment policies, what they're looking for, what they're trying to attract, and try to match up several things when you put your investments there. You need to hopefully be in an area where it has the labor and it has the component supply you're looking for. You also want to be in an area where the local government wants you and you're attracted to them. If you're the fifth guy making axles, they may not be so excited about having you there. So in turn, their incentives. So we have to be on the ground and understand the idiosyncrasies and the goals of each state's investment policies. And these are all driven by clusters. And the clusters, some want to grow their clusters. Some have enough of one one type product and they want something else. So on the ground understanding of each state's incentives is critical. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about again, where these 5 major industries are located. Aerospace, and it's really we say Baja, and it's really the Tijuana area. It's up up near San Diego. Really, it's to feed the Southern Cal defense and aerospace industry, and well established, as I said, it's been there. So if you're looking for your products would use similar labor or similar components, that'd be a cluster area you'd want to look at. Automotive, we talk a lot about automotive, Nuevo León, Saltillo, in and around the greater Monterey area is certainly a good place to be. And again, if you're looking for the labor to support what you're doing. Medical devices, a little bit out west again, out towards Baja, out towards Tijuana, out towards that area. A little bit around Nuevo León, which, a subset maybe of some of the automotive guys. Electronics, more around Mexico City, pretty interesting in that respect. And then lastly, the appliance guys, big in Monterey, a lot of history going in Monterey, with Mabe and the white good guys, and they in turn, established, and then that in turn established the GEs of the world and the Whirlpools of the world moving down in that area. So you have a great manufacturing base as it pertains to painting, stamping, metal bending, welding, that sort of thing. Really quite good. Next slide, please. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about, Dan touched on it briefly, infrastructure. And if you look at the map for the roads, I should say, on the left side, you can see the interconnectivity going from San Diego to El Paso, down, and then all the way across if you wanted to Laredo. Those would be in the case you're importing products perhaps still from Mexico. A lot of guys still like to bring their products in through the States, and that would allow you then to enter Mexico either in San Diego or in Nogales, Juarez, or those areas. The next area would be, well, your maps on the right would be looking at the ports, and you can see you have ample ports on both the East Coast and the West Coast. So good infrastructure, good way to connect the clusters. Next slide, please. So yeah, and just kind of take a quick look here. Not a real surprise. The USA is the largest trading partner in Mexico. Of course, Canada and China trade well with Mexico. So, but the big thing is 75%, 76% of the business goes from Mexico to the USA. And what that really says is now with the USMCA, you're going to have better protection on IP, and I think your border logistics are going to improve. Next slide, please.
Mark, we just had a question that popped up when you were talking about the different areas. Question was, is it difficult to find degreed engineers in Mexico in the different areas where we're putting in operations, assembly operations? Has it been hard for us to find good engineers at assembly operation manufacturing plants?
Yeah, well, the answer is no. Again, because of the clusters, because of the 20, 30, 40 years of companies and institutions investing in education down in Mexico, very, very good senior engineers. When we do a lot of work with graduates, say in the Monterey area from the Monterey School and Monterey University of Technology. So no, yeah, again, 30 years of strong manufacturing has developed a good educational base for engineers. So yeah, and kind of lastly, in a nutshell, kind of wrapping up, Mexico, it's a growing economy, strong economy, highly skilled and available labor force, diversified manufacturing with the 5 major industries we talked about in the clusters, lower manufacturing costs than in China, #1 trading partner with the USA. Now with the MCA, improved IP and cross-border protection, and of course the expansive and growing infrastructure. So really, what it says at the end of the day is Mexico gives you risk diversification out of China, gives you cost diversification out of China, and it gives you growth development as Mexico grows, Central America grows, while you're still shipping to the USA. So I'm gonna turn it back over to Dan.
And Mark, real quickly, when we're looking at, say, Mexican labor rates compared to Thailand and Vietnam, I mean, when we're doing an operation in Thailand, Vietnam versus Mexico, what do we normally find the labor rates to be, the differentiation?
So just generally speaking, as Dan mentioned, Mexico would be about 20% less than China. Vietnam would be about half of what Mexico is, and in Thailand would be about 50-60%, about 60-70% of what Mexico is. Or said it differently, if China is $1, Mexico would be about 80 cents, Thailand would be about 50 cents, and Vietnam would be about a quarter for manufacturing labor in those relative measures.
Yeah, that's all that's been, and we've seen that on the recent projects we've done.
Yes.
Okay, Dan, if you will take it away from here.
Sure, thanks. Talk a little bit about global expansion process and a 5-step process that we use when we're looking at assisting a client with a move to a new geography, whether or not that's for setting up a factory or setting up their supply chain and sourcing. Really, 2 core principles. One, the strategy you develop needs to be company specific and comprehensive. And so we spend a fair bit of time up front with clients trying to understand their business and both from a manufacturing product standpoint, but also their supply chain and the customer base, what it currently is and what the future looks like. And the second core principle we adhere to is that to be successful with this, we need to prevent the disruption to the company operation when we implement. So we look at ourselves as an extension of our client to be able to work on the ground with an implementation to do the things that one we've got experience in, and we can assist clients to get set up more efficiently with a minimal disruptive ongoing operations. First step is in our process is an assessment of the client's business, and this is where we meet with the client to understand the details of their operations, what their current manufacturing footprint is, what the products are, forecast for the product, and whether there are any upcoming foreseen capacity constraints that would require a capacity expansion. Understand the financial priorities of a client, particularly when you're looking at setting up an operation. Do you want to lease or do you want to build? If you want to conserve cash, certainly lease is a good option. Some companies prefer to own their assets, and we can certainly work with that too, but we need to understand that going in. On the supply chain, understand your supplier base, understand the relative amount of make versus buy. Do you really want to keep the manufacturing as much as possible in-house because of IP concerns in particular, or are you open to buying or contract manufacturing? And then around your logistics and warehousing strategies, are you using 3PLs, or do you have relationships with logistics providers, or are you a little more open to looking at regional contacts for those? And on your customer base, where are your customers located? What the markets are in those regions? Particularly in this case, we're talking about Mexico. Do you have a market in Mexico to be able to tap into better by relocating there? Or Mexico is becoming increasingly more important as a supply point to Central and South America. So is that a region that might be appropriate for you in the coming years. Second step is, now that we've understood your requirements, your business, how you operate, we get in and start to assess potential locations for you that might be a fit. We do a lot of work with clients in Southeast Asia, and so in that case, it's very much a choice of a country. Certain countries in Southeast Asia have different manufacturing specialties. In the case of Mexico, it's really more of a regional basis. We've talked a lot about the manufacturing clusters and where they're located, and so try to line up the customer requirements, the client requirements, with the appropriate region that would be the best fit, and within that region, an understanding of available properties, available partners associated with setting up HR, accounting systems, engineering and architectural firms needed for expansion, labor supply, quality of labor, whatnot. And supply chain, understand where potential suppliers are, where would they be located, and on a customer base, potentially proximity to existing customers, and maybe some adjacent industry verticals that might be interesting for you. So trying to line up the possible destinations with your requirements. Third step is really to work with a client to develop an expansion strategy. We've understand the background of your business. We understand and assessed best fits, what we believe are best fits, and then we work together with the client to determine the model going forward. Are you going to source? Are you going to manufacture? Is it going to be contract manufacturing? Do you want to set up a full manufacturing operation? We work through all the questions and the analysis of that to develop that strategy for you. Again, that could be for a manufacturing operation, for a sourcing operation, and then we include the customer-facing aspects of it also, potential sales strategy in a new market to take advantage of being closer to customers in the new region. Fourth step is really about being on the ground, and this is where East West around the world we have resources on the ground, whether it's in China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, or Central Europe, that can take that plan, that strategy, and go deeper into that in the region that we've selected. And this could be anything from meeting with local governments to discuss potential incentives, suppliers of components in your supply chain, to preliminarily qualify them, logistics providers, appropriate legal, accounting, HR services firms that will be important for setting up your operation, doing a little bit of voice of the customer work with your existing customer base, understanding where there may be some opportunities for you to pursue by being located in their region. So again, this is a requirement for this, is that you've got good connections on the ground that know who to talk to, where to go, where to get the information. And then finally, hands-on implementation. East West would assign a program manager for that transition to the new geography. And if you're building something or doing a factory fit out, it would lead the design and construction of that new space. We can assist with recruiting and hiring staff. We very often get involved with recruiting and screening senior staff members for the new operation. Could be plant manager, could be HR manager, finance manager. Those are typically the senior positions that get filled first and when you're moving. Finalize incentive packages with the local government. From the supply chain standpoint, frequently do background checks and due diligence on top 10 suppliers. Particularly in developing economies, this can be a little more of a challenge, and quite candidly, there we find a fair share of problems when we start digging into the supplier arrangements and supplier situation. On the customer side, we get involved in developing your working with potential distributors, and also identifying and assisting with hiring of senior salespeople to set up your sales organization. So that's the 5 steps we follow when we're going through helping a client on an expansion, whether or not it's expansion of supply chain and your manufacturing operation into a new region. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark to talk about a couple of case studies.
Hey, Dan, we had one quick question. Someone just popped up. Can you explain what you mean by supplier due diligence? Due diligence check. What do you mean?
Well, we can investigate. We do some reputational due diligence. Look at if they've been involved in any lawsuits and disputes. We also often look at supplier ownership. We've had a number of situations where there may be 2 or 3 suppliers in a certain area for a certain type of product, and when we dig into it, we find they're essentially all owned and managed by the same family or the same people, so it's really not a competitive situation. So those are a couple examples of the types of due diligence that we often do for clients.
Great, thank you.
Mark?
Okay, yeah, we're gonna talk a little bit about 2 case studies. The first one is going to be about setting up an assembly operation in Mexico, and the second one Dan's going to talk about is establishing a new component supply. Just quickly going through Dan's talked about, we've all talked about the advantages and disadvantages of China Mexico as compared to China, and then Dan has just gone through the East-West 5-step process, which really takes us from an idea in your head to really the hands-on implementation, and that's what these 2 case studies are about. What Dan just spoke about, as far as understanding on the ground, and where we think we do really a pretty good job on that. So the first case study I'm going to talk about is an automotive company had a light assembly operation in China, sourced all of their components in China, did some first pass assembly, and then shipped those off mostly to USA, some to Mexico. As you know, their dependence on China was giving them some problems. Their long lead times, etc. Costs were rising. All the profits were decreasing. So, and due to the fact that their markets were Mexico and primarily the USA, they asked East-West. They asked us to give them a recommendation on setting up an operation in Mexico. Next slide, please, Alex. Yeah. So picking up where Dan in the 5-step process, and I'll go through this pretty quickly because Dan's just spent some time on it. They had a leased operation. They had a year really left on it. They had a good supplier base. They'd been there for 10 or 15 years. They had good local management, but their component supply had been increasing because of their component suppliers. Labor rates have been going up steady for the last 10 years at 10 to 12% a year. And then, of course, now with the tariffs coming in from components from China to the USA, they said that we need to find a way to mitigate this. So we East-West, of course, we're on the ground there. We first wanted to look at sites, potential sites, whether it's a full manufacturing or a light assembly operation, whether we own it or we lease it. We had their costs analysis from what they were doing in China, so we were able to compare that with what was available in Mexico. The permitting process, as we all know, can be a little cumbersome, but we were able to work through most of that, understanding what had to be done based with our team. we evaluated, a number of automotive component suppliers, and not only for availability, meaning are they there, also capacity. A lot of these guys are really, really busy, and then how can we import goods, from the USA into China, USA back into Mexican USA, etc. So in step 3, next slide, please. Sure. So moving more on the ground now, really digging into the cost of the operation, putting together pro formas, getting deeper in with the Mexican suppliers, establishing, how would we do this? And the company really decided, let's go with an assembly operation similar to what we have in China, and let's not go a full-blown manufacturing operation. So basically, it was leasing a building, bringing in the component supplies, working with the client's parent as to setting up a light assembly operation with light assembly lines, test procedures, quality control, et cetera. And that recommendation we put together with the client, and the board approved it. So then moving to step 4. Next
Hey,
slide,
Mark, we
please.
had a question that popped up, which there was when you're looking at those different sites around Mexico to lease the different regions, are there certain areas in Mexico that are not safe to invest in?
Well, I mean, we've all heard some of the stories. Juarez, as many of you know, years ago was pretty dangerous, and you had to have armed convoys going in and out from El Paso. That's been cleaned up and really quite good now. There's been some recent instances out in Sonora with some of the rival gangs out there. So you have to be careful. I mean, you have to keep an eye on things, but generally it's getting much better, and there's still a few hot spots you should probably avoid.
Thank you.
So yeah, so now on the ground, this is where again we get really the hands-on, the business development stuff, where you should go, and how, that sort of stuff. That's pretty basic. Now it's the hands-on. It's negotiating to find the right lease building. It's developing and to get into the right site. It's working with the local state to see if you can get the best or what is the best tax incentives. It's knowing what state's looking for what, so you can craft your strategy to perhaps the state that's more attractive as it relates to incentives. Much deeper dig into the suppliers and the auditing of suppliers, and at this point even taking down the client to them also qualify the suppliers. So now we're deep into it, and we go to step 5, which is we bring in we have a project manager at that time who's going to work very closely with the client on timetables, on budgets, on working on setting up selected suppliers, working on the legal entity, working on assembly operation, working with the client to import equipment, to set up the assembly, to set up the test procedures, to understand how to get the operating permits, the fire permits, then of course assist with commissioning and startup, end of line auditing, et cetera, and of course assist in hiring and training of some of the key local personnel. Because remember now, this project manager that we have down there, he knows really what's going on. He knows what's required because he's been trying to do it himself. So he's a good asset when it comes to assisting and hiring of key personnel. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so long and short of it is, we're running a little bit late here. We profit improvement of about $2.5 million, and that really came from elimination of tariffs going into the States from the USA, from China, and reduced logistics costs. Inventory was reduced because we didn't have components and finished goods on the water for 8 to 10 weeks, and we were able to reduce our delivery time from 8 to 10 weeks down to 3. But also, maybe just as important, our ordering process was much more accurate because we could change orders up and we could change forecasts up to 3 weeks out. Where in the case of ordering from China, once you loaded that container and set that order process, you had to set it 10 to 12 weeks out. So all in all, a very successful project. Dan?
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah. Yep. So moving on to a second case study, and this is one related to setting up sourcing in a supply chain in Mexico. This was a company, it was a supplier of upscale kitchenware, and they were sourcing utensils and cookware in southern China. They'd been doing this for a number of years, and they'd set up an extensive supply chain there where they had engineers and quality assurance staff located there to work with their suppliers and ensure that they were getting the product they wanted, the quantity they wanted. The introduction of the tariffs added about $8 million to their cost of continuing to supply from China. So this was a big hit for them. So they made the decision to evaluate sourcing in Mexico, and East West came in to work with them to look at their supply chain spend and determine what type of products and where and how to successfully source them from Mexico. First step was a deep dive with the client to try to understand their business, understand the company background, and particularly the products and the manufacturing processes and the supplier competencies that were really key to being able to meet their needs, and a cost breakdown. We wanted to understand the target costs that they were looking for. And then volume requirements and growth plans. We want to understand, when we're looking at suppliers and talking with suppliers, we want to understand the forecasted growth and the relative number of and the relative scale of the spend. Took that information and evaluated Mexico and regions within Mexico for the appropriate location, looking at supplier base. And so for them, they needed companies that were capable and skilled in casting and metal stamping, coating and enameling, concerned about security and ease of access from the U.S., anticipated a need for regular visits and interaction from the U.S. staff, engineers, quality assurance people once this was up and running. Want to be able to get to the supplier and feel comfortable moving in and out of the area. Certainly logistics and connectivity to the U.S. border. This product was going back to the U.S. and being supplied to the ultimate customers in the U.S. So having good access to the major highways and being able to make that trip relatively quickly to the border and then distribution was important. And we ended up settling in Monterey as a focus area, and very much as a result of the depth and breadth of the suppliers, long history of supplying into the automotive and appliance industry, and actually found some specialty manufacturers of cookware in that area also. Worked with the client in the third step to determine what products they would bring in. And the initial move, the initial target was to bring in about 20% of the China spend into Mexico and start there with a focus on the higher volume products to reduce the complexity of the transition. The assumption being that when this was done successfully, they would expand on and continue to expand their sourcing in Mexico and de-emphasize China. And needed to find suppliers with the appropriate technical capabilities, but also the ability to provide warehousing and stocking. We weren't looking for a just-in-time situation, but did want the suppliers to hold some of that inventory and to be capable of shipping and customs clearance in a quick manner. We developed a short list of suppliers, and we developed an RFP, working with a client, developed an RFP to go out for sourcing. On the ground, we issued an RFP, went to a short list of 12 suppliers, and evaluated their proposals. They were quite complete. But in addition to that, East West's folks visited those suppliers and did audits, looking at their production equipment and processes, their systems for quality and material planning, their customer service capability, and their compliance, EHS and labor compliance, certainly. And we selected 3 suppliers that came to the top of the list to recommend to the client. And then finally, project manager for East West really managed this transition, worked with the client to manage the transition, arranged for client visits to the customers, worked with the client on negotiating the final contracts with the suppliers, and that would include initial pricing, payment terms. Also looked at price breaks for volume and improved productivity as went on, specified inventory holding and stocking requirements. And as we went through this, and certainly we became a vital team member for the client and facilitated establishing their project team to speed this transition. And then one thing that we did work that was a little bit different was that we worked with the client and some of their suppliers in China to move some of the tooling and manufacturing equipment from China to Mexico to reduce the cost and improve the speed of setting up in the new region. Now, at the end of it, it was a successful project. We started sourcing in less than 3 months, and then within 3 months after that, we successfully completed their evaluation processes and moved ahead. Lead times were much improved. Again, we reduced the 6-week transit time on the water. The costs were reduced about $400,000 versus sourcing these products in the U.S. And inventories reduced by 30%, or over $1 million in cash was available. And certainly the proximity to the client reduced lead time so that we could better handle changes in demand and again, eliminate the tariff impact for those products that we moved across. So overall, it was a successful project and was fully implemented within 6 months. Alex?
Thank you, Dan. If you go to the next slide. So briefly, we're here at an hour. We've got some more questions popped up. One of them just recently was, we'll answer one more question, then we'll have to stop it. The question was to Mark and Dan of how many of the companies, the work we're doing on the ground in Mexico now, how many of these projects do you think are influenced by the U.S.-China tariffs, which are causing a lot of the Chinese vendors to be uncompetitive? And I think the answer there is quite a number of the companies looking at is New Mexico is because of the tariffs. But it's also, I mean, it's just one, coronavirus is one more thing on the tariffs, one more thing on the higher labor costs in China. Right. That's causing that diversification. People look at Asia and Mexico.
That's right, Alex. I think it's cumulative. I think it started with the labor rates rising over the last 5 to 10 years. Then it moved to transparency issues in China. Then it moved to China 2025, which is kind of an anti-American buy China philosophy. Then the labor rates went up, the tariffs went on, and now the coronavirus. So I think it's just one straw after another on the camel's back. That's really moved it that way.
Right. So first of all, thank you all very much for taking the time. We've got part 1 that's already on the website. If you want to go in and look at those tactical responses, those are all around responses that companies can take in Asia and Mexico that are short-term actions right now to address what's going on with coronavirus. This is the part 2, which is specifically around Mexico. And then on the 22nd of this month, we're doing the risk verification, looking at Asia, specifically Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines, the 3 areas where we'll be focusing our attention on. Please feel free to join us on that. Again, that is with the coronavirus, how companies are mitigating that risk and finding risk diversification in Mexico and in Asia. But thank you very much, and we will be forwarding out surveys. Please feel free to respond to those. We would appreciate your feedback. Thank you very much for taking the time. Bye-bye.